From the Gert Boyle studio, I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB about the place you call home. 2025 was a weird year in so many different ways. The word unprecedented got a lot of use, especially at the national level. And here in Oregon, we found ourselves in the spotlight again as part of an extraordinary action taken by President Trump.
The Oregon National Guard has begun calling up Guard members and expects to deploy about 200 troops to Portland per President Donald Trump's orders.
Portland is on fire. Portland's been on fire for years.
Portland's doing just fine. And I made that very clear to the president this morning.
It's like living in hell.
I was in Portland yesterday and had the chance to visit with the governor of Oregon and also the mayor. They're in town, and they are absolutely covering up the terrorism that is hitting their streets.
She asked us to set up a free speech zone. I responded, the entire city of Portland is a free speech zone.
Say it loud and say it clear! Immigrants are welcome here! Immigrants are welcome here!
Don't take the bait, Portland. Don't help President Trump achieve his goal of violence and riots.
What is your problem?
The federal agents there have been using tear gas. There's a residential area near the ICE facility. So I said, hey, can you stop doing that?
Attorneys for the Trump administration plan to argue the president has the authority to federalize and deploy the National Guard.
After a lot of legal back and forth, the Supreme Court weighed in, and the president recalled troops from Portland, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And recently, the Trump administration dropped its appeal of a decision made by a federal judge in Oregon that blocked the president from deploying National Guard troops to Portland. In a way, this reversal marks an end to the story that started in September of last year when the president announced he was sending troops into Oregon's largest city. At least, kind of. The president has made statements implying that he intends to send troops back to Portland and other cities at some point.
And we may, if we're allowed to, the most powerful thing we haven't used, the Insurrection Act.
Throughout this whole saga, OPB has been reporting and adding context to a story that is both local and national. We learned a lot in the process about the role of the courts in relation to the executive branch, about the difference between what's actually happening on the ground, government narratives, and public perception, and about the different kinds of protesters and their motivations for dissent. We wanted to break down some of that work with three smart journalists who've been in the thick of it. OPB criminal justice and legal affairs reporter Conrad Wilson, OPB public safety reporter Troy Brenelson, and their editor Michelle Wiley. Okay, here we go. So there was a big difference between what President Trump and his aides had to say about Portland and the descriptions from our local politicians.
And I get a call from the liberal governor. Sir, please don't come in. We don't need you. I said, well, unless they're playing false tapes, this looked like World War II. Your place is burning down.
Conrad, what was actually happening at the ICE building in the summertime before the attempt to deploy the National Guard into Portland?
It's a lot to unpack, but things popped off in June when Trump announced a big immigration crackdown. And we saw protesters in Los Angeles respond with this big swell of immigration enforcement, and that's when we started sort of seeing like arrests in parking lots, right? Like really aggressive arrests in Home Depot parking lots, kind of hit social media. It was just kind of shocking, the aggressive tactics. In response to the protests there in Southern California, Trump federalized the California National Guard and also sent in the military. And it really set the stage for what happened next in Portland, where in mid-June, we saw in Portland really some of the largest and frankly, some of the most, violent protests that we've seen since 2020.
June was, I think, probably the start of when we started to see some of these differing narratives that we're probably going to talk about. Portland had been pretty quiet, I would say, when it comes to protesting the second Trump administration up until that June 14th No Kings protest. And that day we saw scores of protesters go to the ICE building. There were rocks being thrown. At one point, a group of protesters used like a stop sign to try to break down the front of the building. And we saw federal law enforcement respond with force, with tear gas and pepper balls. It was a really, kind of like the first day of the second Trump administration that a Portland protest had really taken off in a way that we had seen years ago. And that is also when you started to see that the plywood go up around the building, this sort of fortress look that it has taken on. And then, to be honest, it was relatively quiet after late June throughout July, August, and most of September even, too.
Yeah, in September is when we really start to see things kind of picking up again. Like, this is also when the president is invoking Portland. In some of the clips we heard, he's bringing it up at press avails. I remember throughout that month, we have C-SPAN on in the newsroom and watching C-SPAN and being like, is he going to talk about Portland? Like, every time he was on screen. And so in September, when he starts invoking Portland, that's really when protests start picking up again. This is when there was this plywood guillotine that was rolled out in front of the building. Protesters are just, but I think it's just important to stress, it's still pretty small scale up until the Guard is deployed.
And Troy, I know you did some reporting on ICE activity in Oregon around that time, not just activity at the ICE building. What did that look like?
I think that's a good question, Jen. I think that it's important to stress that, like, immigration protests that we've talked about, that was the bulk of what the attention has been on the city. But immigration enforcement up until that point, like we're talking early summer, had been relatively quiet. Oregon and Washington were both trending down near the bottom of states where it was like numbers of apprehensions that we were seeing, even though Trump had been out very publicly announcing that he wanted to be very aggressive with his immigration enforcement efforts. But we did have some just really high profile cases. We had a family that was caught up near the Canadian border with 4 children who were detained for several weeks by Border Patrol. We had a group of 2 wildfire firefighters in the middle of a wildfire in Washington State get apprehended, and a father taking his child to preschool. Those things really caught the attention of the Portlanders.
This is also a time where we start to see the targeting of the immigration system itself, right? People being, who are seeking asylum in the country, they have immigration court dates, and arrests by immigration enforcement officers actually happening at court, which puts people, who are seeking asylum or have an immigration issue in a really difficult position, right? Of having to decide, am I going to go to my court date and risk potentially being arrested by ICE, or am I not going to go to my court date, but then fall into kind of a status with my case where I've basically violated the terms, right, of my release into the country and risk arrest in a different way. So it was sort of a no-win situation, at least in June.
And pretty much immediately after the announcement about sending troops to Portland, there was this legal fight that began over whether or not this deployment could actually happen. Michelle, can you tell us about the initial lawsuit filed by leaders at the state and local level?
Yeah, so I remember this day vividly. It was a Sunday. We get the official word, the Oregon Guard members being federalized. And within hours of that kind of official announcement, the city of Portland and the state of Oregon file a lawsuit challenging the underlying reasoning. They're essentially saying, we don't need the Guard here. There isn't a justification for sending them into the city. And also, this potentially violates federal law because you're not supposed to send troops in to do domestic law enforcement, right? So we see this very immediate lawsuit challenging the underlying reasoning behind the deployment. And then shortly after that, I think it was filed on Monday, there's this ask for a temporary restraining order, where basically the city and the state are saying, not only do we not believe that the reasons that you've submitted for needing to put the Guard in are accurate, reasonable, they're also saying we want to stop the Guard from coming, like even deploying on the streets at all. We need to block this immediately. And so they take that to a federal judge, Karen Immergut. And just to remind people, this is all happening in the course of about a week. So like Trump posts about it on Saturday. On Sunday, we get the official word. Filings on Monday. By Friday, we have a hearing in front of Judge Immergut. And she issues the first temporary restraining order on Saturday, blocking the Oregon National Guard from deploying into Portland.
You mentioned Karen Immergut. Conrad, could you tell us a little bit more about Karen Immergut, the federal judge who ended up hearing the case in Portland? Who is she? What is her background?
So she's universally respected, well-liked, really not a political person and considered just a very brilliant legal mind. She's a longtime Republican, a former state and federal prosecutor. She worked on Ken Starr's investigation into President Clinton. And she also served as Oregon's U.S. attorney. She was appointed by George W. Bush and was appointed to the federal bench by President Trump during his first term.
Mm-hmm. And right after Immergut's initial ruling, the Trump administration tried to get around the temporary restraining order by sending hundreds of troops from California and Texas. Conrad, what happened with that?
Yeah, I remember this really vividly because it was the day after she issued her order. So it was a Sunday night, actually. And she held an emergency hearing via phone. And it just, it was a lot of uncertainty about what was happening. And over the course of the hearing, it became clear that the Trump administration had sent federalized, so these are National Guard members under the president's control, federalized Guard troops from California to Oregon, and was also calling up Texas National Guard members to send to Oregon and Illinois. And Immergut, she really kept her cool, but you could just tell she was not happy because she said, maybe you didn't and the Trump administration's argument, right, was that we're not federalizing new troops. We're not violating your order. We're moving troops that were already under the president's authority, and we're just moving them to Oregon. And she said, no, that's not going to fly. Like, that violates the spirit of my order, right? And so issued actually a second temporary restraining order that blocked any federalized National Guard troops from being deployed to Oregon, full stop.
We would later find out, just important to mention, that after she issues this first order, the order that kept Oregon troops from being federalized, there was actually a deployment to the ICE building. This is on that Saturday. It's hard to keep track of all these days, but the Saturday where she issued that very first order, we found out like a month later that, almost a month later, that a couple of members of the Oregon National Guard were at the ICE building. We don't know what they were doing there or if it violated the order. It's a little unclear based on the timing and what court records have shown, but that did come up.
Mm-hmm. Troy, you were actually at the ICE building that night after Immergut issued her initial temporary restraining order. So I'm curious, what were the protests like?
Yeah, I had been going to the protests like a lot heading into that day. And honestly, that particular day, all of the things that Conrad and Michelle have been talking about were, I think, at the forefront of everybody's minds. We had Trump putting Portland, in the media, in the headlines consistently. We had a lot of federal law enforcement beginning to show up at the facility, and the protest crowds were getting larger. And I think going into that day, I got there, early evening. Didn't quite know when I started the day what to expect, but by the time I arrived, we'd had the news that that Immergut wasn't going to allow the National Guard to come in immediately. And so it was almost like, for a moment, fairly anticlimactic, right? It was like this thing for at least the next couple weeks. We're going to push it back. Protests are going to continue as they were, but it wasn't going to be a National Guard deployment that we'd been sort of expecting. And so then, pretty typical night, I would say. There was another reporter and I, Alex Zielinski, were covering. But then I've talked about this. It was fairly strange. The amount of force that we ended up seeing that night was very striking from the federal law enforcement. And a typical, fairly quiet protest crowd was met with a lot of tear gas that night, a lot of pepper balls, in a way that I haven't really quite been able to square, other than the fact that in addition to that use of force, we saw like a pretty slick camera crew in the presence as well, coming out from behind the gates. And shortly thereafter, so Immerget issues her decision, and then now we've got social media posts going about really sort of valorizing the federal law enforcement there. And I would say like portraying the city of Portland as a lot more dire than what it was that particular evening.
Well, and the thing that came out of it, right, was a really slick produced video that the Department of Homeland Security released.
Right. Yeah. No, it was very strange to see.
Coming up after a break, we're going to look back at the last time Portland protests were in the spotlight and talk about how things took a different turn here 5 years later. Thanks for listening to The Evergreen, our podcast from OPB about the place you call home. Don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app so you can listen to new episodes every Monday. And remember, this episode with local journalists providing nuanced context to one of the biggest news events of the past year, and all the great OPB reporting and storytelling you hear on the show is made possible by the support of many thousands of OPB members. Support our journalism by becoming an OPB sustaining member today at opb.org/pod. And now, back to the show. I want to briefly go back to the protests that happened here in 2020 during President Trump's first term, because I think that's what the president had in mind when he said that Portland was on fire.
For the Police Bureau, this incident has been declared a riot. You are ordered to disperse. You are subject to arrest and use of force, including crowd control munitions and tear gas. Leave the area now.
Conrad, I know that you covered these protests that started in late May of 2020 after Minneapolis police murdered George Floyd. There were protests in many cities around the country, but Portland really stood out. Will you remind us why the city ended up in the national spotlight then?
These were just really big protests. And if you have to remember back at that time, right, I mean, it's COVID and it's springtime. Folks are sort of coming out, and the size of the protests we saw in Portland in response to George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis, were absolutely massive, right? As the summer wore on, the tenor of the protests really coalesced outside the federal courthouse in downtown Portland. And they were met with a huge response from federal law enforcement. Hundreds of federal law enforcement officers, from the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security came into the city to protect the courthouse and policing. And there was a lot more coordination, really, between local law enforcement, state police, and federal law enforcement during that time. And, the protest just went on night after night for more than 100 nights, really. And as they continued, they became more aggressive, more violent in some ways, a lot of the clashes, and more directed at the Trump administration outside, the federal courthouse. And in some ways, they kept going far beyond 100 nights, but the tenor of them changed into something that, became sort of like a vigilantism, like smashed windows, like the Antifa motif that I think the city has just had a hard time moving on from, and sort of, is only really recently kind of emerged from those 2020 protests in some ways.
And clearly 2020, I think, was on a lot of people's mind as Oregon public officials repeatedly cautioned protesters not to, quote, take the bait when President Trump first started talking about sending in the National Guard last year.
We don't want to take the bait. We really want to focus on safety and security in our city.
Troy, before the break, you were talking a little bit about what the protest looked like in early October. How did things unfold at the ICE building over that month?
Yeah, I think it was really interesting to see how there were a lot of different viewpoints and tactics, for lack of a better phrase, in the protest community. I think there were like the images that we've all seen on social media of the inflatable costumes, people dancing, people taking a pretty whimsical approach to protest. I think to sort of blunt some of the image of Portland on fire. It's like, how could a city be on fire if we're doing the cha-cha slide out here? And there's so that was one point of view. But you also just had large actual organized demonstrations too. We had the Naked Bike Ride came out in large numbers to protest the immigration enforcement tactics, and we also had crowds that were very persistent, into the evening. We still had repeated clashes between local protesters and federal law enforcement whenever they came in and out of the building in order to do sort of these personnel exchanges. So there was quite a dichotomy going on a nightly basis at the facility.
At the same time, all this was going on at the ICE building on Portland's South Waterfront. The fight over whether or not troops could actually be deployed continued to play out in court. Judge Immergitt prevented the Guard from deploying to Portland, at least temporarily, so the administration appealed to the Ninth Circuit.
We're ready to proceed with argument in State of Oregon, City of Portland versus Donald J. Trump, case number 26-6268.
But y'all, it was super confusing. There were two different restraining orders, and the Ninth Circuit issued an emergency ruling on one, but not the other, or maybe it ruled on both, depending on which legal scholar you've talked to. Meanwhile, there was also an actual trial on the issues in Judge Immergitt's courtroom. Conrad, you and Troy did cover that 3-day trial. What came to light during that trial? Conrad, maybe if you could start first.
Well, I mean, the biggest thing was just that the Oregon Guard did briefly deploy to the building. I mean, that was something we learned right away. We also learned that just, the way federal law enforcement officers talked about what they were seeing outside the building just stood in such stark contrast to the way Portland police officers who testified talked about what they were seeing with the protests. And, with the hindsight of sort of the 2020 protests hanging over this whole trial, I think Portland police had a lot of credibility, and that was ultimately something that the federal judge in the case kind of saw in the way Portland police testified about this being like a protest that they were able to handle, right? And didn't really buy into the argument so much that federal law enforcement were making, where this was something that was outside everyone's control and they needed the military's support.
I would just echo that it was really striking to see how it was crucial to the Trump administration and the Justice Department's arguments that the Portland Police Bureau could not handle the protests, and they had to testify. And really, we had 3 Portland Police Bureau top brass testifying during that trial, and all of them taking a pretty transparent, I would say, stance to say, not only do we feel like we have it under control, but that it seemed to us when we were watching the protests, when we were watching the clashes as cars were coming in and out of the building, that it appeared to the Portland Police Bureau that federal law enforcement and their tactics were in fact escalating the situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what did Judge Immergitt say in her final ruling in early November?
So she said that basically the federal government, did not have the ability to deploy the National Guard. She blocked their deployment permanently. And it was, it said basically the Trump administration, she didn't really find a lot of merit in their case. Sure, some federal law enforcement officers had been injured, and she said that was unacceptable during these protests. But by and large said, this is not the kind of thing that requires military intervention.
Yeah, and I think, we've talked about it a little bit, but she discussed also, she did find Portland police more credible. She found their assessment of what was going on the ground, their approach, their expertise to really kind of win the day, I guess, and informed her opinion about how things should move forward. It was a big win for Oregon.
And since the temporary restraining orders had expired and essentially been replaced by this ruling, That was then appealed by the Trump administration, right, Conrad?
That's right. The Trump administration did appeal Judge Immergit's injunction. And actually, a couple of months passed, and they later decided, they told the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that they actually didn't want to appeal the case anymore. And that's something that the city of Portland, the state of Oregon, and California both, said, hey, that works for us.
And Conrad, I mean, do you have a sense of why the administration dropped the appeal?
I don't know for certain, but had a federal appeals court basically upheld Judge Immergit's decision to block the guard, I mean, that would have been a much stronger decision that had more sweeping implications, right? So it would have been kind of an even bigger loss for the Trump administration had the appeals court sided with Judge Immergit.
Got it.
So in dismissing their appeal, it sort of is maybe a way of mitigating the loss that they had in Oregon.
And I know this issue also made its way to the Supreme Court in relation to a different case about sending the National Guard into Chicago. Where does that stand now?
Yes, we've been talking a lot about Portland, but the question about the National Guard going into U.S. cities has been kind of playing out across the country. In the Chicago case, similarly, a judge issued a temporary restraining order blocking the Guard deployment. That got appealed up to the Supreme Court, and it got put on the shadow docket, so there was, never going to be oral arguments over it. This happened, I think it was sometime in the fall, and then I remember checking the docket in December, trying to see if they'd make a decision, what the decision would be, because it could be really consequential, right? Ultimately, they dismissed it, which meant that the lower court's ruling stood. So the Guard was blocked from deploying to Chicago. And, now that we know that they've also are attempting to drop the appeal in Oregon, it does sort of make me wonder how much the Supreme Court's decision affected their thinking in Oregon's case, too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, Troy, you also reported on ICE activity while all of this was unfolding, which is, of course, the reason many people came out to protest in the first place, the way ICE is behaving. What did you see in terms of arrests and just ICE presence in the Portland area?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't stress enough that it's like, it helps me to think about this as like two tracks, because you have actual immigration enforcement and then the protests and this sort of other focus from the Trump administration that's like what the city's status is and everything. From an immigration enforcement perspective, I mentioned earlier that it was relatively quiet in Oregon and Washington compared to other parts of the country when it came to immigration enforcement. But that really ticked up shortly after Immergit's decision. It was at the very least a coincidence that we were starting to see Department of Homeland Security officials just go to social media after effectively losing in federal court and saying, we've got an operation in Portland. We've apprehended hundreds more people than we had actually seen as reporters in the months prior to that. It really seemed like there was a concentrated effort suddenly throughout October, November, and December to really be aggressive in not just the city of Portland, but suburbs like Vancouver, Washington, and Beaverton and Woodburn. I will say, even if Portland, for whatever reason, has been relatively quiet to start 2026, it seems like so far we're off to a pretty interesting start to this year, and who knows where it's going to go.
Mm-hmm. And for now, no National Guard troops are coming to Portland. But it does sound like President Trump left the door open to that. So, Conrad, could we see the National Guard deployed to Portland in 2026?
I mean, we don't know, right? I mean, the president did talk about, even when he said we're putting a pause on the domestic military deployments in Portland and other cities, a couple of days later, he said, crime's going to come back and that'll be our opportunity to redeploy the military. And he talked about, we haven't used the Insurrection Act yet, but said, that's a tool that the president's able to use. And so, your guess is as good as mine, but he definitely left the door open and, we'll have to see.
Mm-hmm. So what do you all feel like you have learned from covering this? Troy, you want to start off?
It's brutal that you're starting with me. I think, to be honest, one of the things that I'm continue to be focused on, and it goes back to your question earlier about when the protests started here, for Portlanders to not like take the bait. And when that occurred, I remember talking to a lot of protesters who actually took issue with that phrasing. Like we talked about the whimsy out there, but there were Portlanders who felt like that sort of verbiage put the onus on them not to react to when they were having force used against them. And this isn't so much a lesson, but it is something I'm looking at where, again, when we do have uses of force by federal law enforcement, including deadly force being used, I think it's really important to be paying attention to this sort of tug and pull of like who is escalating the situation versus who is de-escalating the situation.
Mm-hmm. Totally. How about y'all?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was such an interesting insight into sort of this exploration of presidential power. Like I kept being asked, like, well, can the president deploy the National Guard in Portland and other cities and other states over the objection of governors? And it's like, trying to get an answer to that question was so interesting because I started talking to people, who study this, right? Historians and legal scholars. And like, they were like, we don't really know because this isn't something that has really been tried to this extent before. And so it was sort of this, front row seat to like, what are the outer bounds of presidential authority in a way that felt like very national, but also very, very local to like a city block here in Portland where the protests have been taking place.
I think what I learned, I guess it's almost more of a reflection of just sort of the feeling of having Portland be back in the spotlight. There's this image of the city that really took hold, especially after the 2020 protests. And in some ways, nationally, that still exists for a lot of people. And I think it's just been interesting to see the kind of discrepancy between the way that the city is portrayed nationally versus what it really looks like on the ground here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for being here to provide context for this important and ongoing moment in Oregon history.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Conrad Wilson is an OPB reporter covering criminal justice and legal affairs. Troy Brunelson is an OPB reporter covering public safety. And Michelle Wiley is the editor for OPB's Public Safety and Health team. It's unclear where this story is going exactly, but you can be sure OPB will continue covering it. And you can find all of that coverage at opb.org. Thank you very much for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. Julie Sabatier produced this episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray. Layla Isbell engineered the episode. The OPB podcast team also includes Mia Estrada and Sage Van Wing. Sergio Olmos recorded the sound you heard from a Portland protest in 2020. Our theme music comes from Audio Network. If you have a question for us, please reach out. You can email us at theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. I'll catch you later.